just this moment where you feel really challenged, you feel really excited. And then when you get out, you're like, what? That was incredible. So yeah, there is physiologic process behind it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Major League Nutrition Show. I'm your host, Nicole Chenard, and you are in for a treat today. Today's host, I cannot wait to introduce you to. We have a lot in common, but she's way ahead of me in the field of nutrition and exercise. Her name is Dr. Rachele Pojednic. She is an associate professor and program director of exercise science in the Department of Health and Human Performance at Norwich University in Vermont, where she examines therapies designed to enhance performance and recovery. She's also the director of scientific research and education at Restore Hyper Wellness, which we'll be talking about in the show, and a research associate at the Institute of Lifestyle Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and an award-winning faculty member at the Harvard Extension School. Previously, she was a tenure-track assistant professor in the nutrition department at my alma mater, Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. For the past decade, Dr. Pojednic's work has examined nutrition, supplementation, and physical activity interventions on muscle physiology, performance, and recovery, as well as muscle-related chronic disease. She has received research funding from the NIH, National Institutes of Health, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and the Vermont Biomedical Research Network, an NIH IDEA network of biomedical research excellence program. She has published extensively on vitamin D and CBD supplementation and their effects on skeletal muscle in health and disease, muscle physiology and aging with a focus on sarcopenia, physiologic metrics of muscle recovery in warfighters, the effects of nutrition and exercise intervention on diseases such as obesity and type 2 diabetes, and educational models for the healthcare professionals focused on nutrition and exercise, like yours truly. Dr. Pojednic serves on the governance board for the American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM, Exercises Medicine Initiative, the education board for the MedFit organization, and on the scientific advisory board for Healy.ai. She also, can you believe it? There's more. She also has served as the co-chair of the ACSM EIM Education Committee, was the interim executive director for the Prescription for Activity Task Force and the American Council on Exercise, ACE, Industry Advisory Panel. Dr. Pojednic has a particular passion for science communication, as you'll see in this video, or if you're listening, she's an amazing communicator and has been a consultant and writer for several organizations, including Time, the Washington Post, no big deal, Popular Science, Self, Shape, Women's Health, all the big magazines, Forbes, Runner's World, and Boston Magazine. She's also been a member of the fitness community for 20 years as an indoor cycling instructor and an ambassador for Specialized and Lululemon. Dr. Pojednic received her PhD from the Tufts University Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy in biochemical and molecular nutrition and exercise physiology. Amazing school, one of the best. In fact, the only nutrition school in the country. There's several programs, but Tufts has the only school. She also holds an education master's in EDM in physical education and coaching from Boston University and a BS in cardiopulmonary and exercise science from Northeastern University. I'm also an alum of Northeastern, so we have so much in common. Her research at Tufts was completed in the Nutrition, Exercise, Physiology, and Sarcopenia Laboratory at the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, where she was awarded the Ruth L. Kirstein National Research Service Award by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Congratulations. She holds a Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification from the National Strength and Conditioning Association and is a board certified health coach from the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaches. no big deal. And she spent a lot of time talking to me today, and I'm so grateful. I follow her on Instagram, and she is the best science, nutrition, health, exercise myth buster I've ever encountered. She's so helpful, and everybody needs her. So without further ado, Dr. Rachele Pojednic. And here she is, Dr. Rachele Pojednic. I'm going to start off by saying I tried cryotherapy recently.
What did you think?
I didn't know what to expect, but I loved it. And the thing I loved the most was I felt like I could think more clearly afterward. Is that common?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of, first, thank you for having me on. Really excited to talk about
Of
all the things
course.
that we're going to talk about today, and that we're jumping right into cryotherapy. But yeah, cryotherapy is a really interesting one. Most of the data for cryotherapy is in cold water swimmers, and it's sort of translated into this cold plunge mania and cryotherapy. But one of the outcomes is that you get this sort of, rush from feeling so cold. Your nervous system is just really heightened and turned on. And that's why you get that sort of couple of moments of just complete, euphoria and mental clarity. Because essentially that it's a fight or flight response where, you're just completely freezing. And it's also fun if you go to the Restore cryotherapy, they put a music on for you where you can sort of dance around. And it's just this moment where you feel really challenged, you feel really excited. And then when you get out, you're like, what? That was incredible. So yeah, there is physiologic process behind it.
Yeah. Is there any science behind the song you choose? Because if for everyone who's listening who hasn't tried it, they say, okay, you're going to go in for 3 minutes, no more, no less. And we're going to choose a song that lasts 3 minutes. So choose the song you like. And I have a funny story about my song choice, but
what's your song choice? Because we always want to know.
The White Stripes, Seven Nation Army, and loved it. Another time I chose another song that was very mellow, and I said, no, this is not the right song for this experience.
You need a hype up song. Totally. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The hype up song. Okay.
Yeah. Mine's Unstoppable by Sia. It's exactly 3 minutes long. Yeah. It's a good one.
That's awesome. Yeah. And if anyone wants to see it, I posted this on Instagram, so you can see me going in and coming out of the cryotherapy. And I tagged Dr. Rachele Pojednic in it because she inspired that post. And
if you're a content creator, it's always an epic video because you get the steam that comes out when you open up the cryo door. And so, yeah, it's always good content.
Yes. But tell us more about the science behind it and the nervous system, and who shouldn't use it, which there's some people who shouldn't use it. Obviously, there's always a caveat. And then who really benefits from it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons that I started working with Restore, my primary appointment, my faculty appointment is at Norwich University, which is in central Vermont. It's a senior military college. And I recently transitioned to an online role with them, creating some programming for active duty warfighters, essentially to help them train their soldiers, sailors, Marines, more effectively from an evidence-based perspective. And so I started working at Restore kind of in parallel with that, because there was a real interesting overlap between these two populations where with sports athletes or weekend warriors, like we all want to feel good. And if you can get on the podium and it's something like, an Olympic vision, of course, we want to make sure that we're optimizing as best we can. But for the warfighters, this is something, if they're not optimized, if they're not recovered, it could be, a life or death situation if they're out in the field or deployed. And so when Restore reached out to me and they said, hey, we've got all these modalities that we think are really great for human performance optimization and for recovery, but there's very little data on them. Would you come and work with us to help understand exactly what is going on? Enter cryotherapy, right? And everybody right now is just, as we mentioned just a second ago, just nuts about cold plunging and all of the benefits that could
And Wim
potentially be coming
Hof.
from that. Exactly. And so when you look at the data, there's actually very, very, very little data on cold therapy. The good thing is, to your point, most of the data is compelling and interesting from a recovery and performance perspective. And most of the data, as I mentioned just a moment ago, actually is in cold water swimmers. So there's a population of hardcore people that mostly live in their, sort of originated in the Scandinavian part of the world, Sweden, Finland, where they go and swim in the middle of the winter time. And the data started to emerge early on that they were happier. They had, sort of better, muscular tone. They had, better mental health. And I think people originally were just kind of like, oh, it's just because they're a little bit nuts and they're out there together in this freezing cold, but they've got this great community. And that's certainly part of it. But then there was a couple of groups that really started to dig into it and said, you know what, I think something really interesting is going on here. And so again, the data is still in its infancy on the actual interventional data. So all of that data in those Scandinavian populations are what we call observational. So they go out and they collect a bunch of data on people that are already doing the thing. In this case, the thing is swimming in cold water. And they said, oh, we're seeing all these really wonderful outcomes compared to the rest of the population. About 10 years ago, maybe, we started to see some interventional research, which means that we take people and put them into a cold situation, something like a cold plunge or cryotherapy, and start to study the outcomes that happen after that exposure. And so the data is, as I mentioned, again, still mostly in cold water immersion, mostly because it's easy, right? Like anybody can fill their tub up with cold, icy water, and it's easy to do that in the lab. Cryotherapy is new because it's a machine that is essentially fueled by liquid nitrogen. So that's what makes it really cold. And they're really expensive. Most academic labs don't have them. Again, come back to the idea that Restore was like, hey, will you come?
Them?
Yeah, exactly. Will you come and do some research, make this your sort of research playground? I was like, oh, cool. So cryotherapy machines is one of the machines that we have. So what is the data actually showing? It's limited, but in the sort of early sense, we see that it likely reduces inflammation. So that's logical because essentially in your extremities, and if anybody's ever had an injury and you put ice on it, it's going to reduce that inflammation, keep the redness out, keep the swelling down. And the reason that that happens is essentially you stop blood flow from going to that very cold place, and that inflammatory response is reduced. Now, remember, this can be good or bad because not all inflammation is bad. So I'm going to come back to that point in just a second. So it does seem to be that inflammation starts to go down. That's great. The other piece that is really interesting is this mental health piece. And you mentioned Wim Hof and these breathing techniques in really cold situations. And so you've experienced this. So when you go into the cryotherapy machine, what is the very first thing that happens to you? You just feel like...
I'll say the first time I was so excited and just I was thinking, okay, when am I going to get cold? And it wasn't until the last minute of the 3 minutes. I wasn't cold until then. And I also thought to myself, if I have to say something, can they hear me?
Yeah, we can. There's a speaker. Yes.
You're kind of in it's like an upright tanning bed.
Chamber,
that's how
exactly.
But it's the opposite. It's cold. What else? I don't know, a closet. What else can I compare it to? Or
so contrast that to, have you ever experienced jumping into freezing cold water?
Oh, not. Here's the thing. I played ice hockey.
Yep.
I
so
had
you're
a
used to the cold.
I'm thinking of things as we're talking. I had a tournament. I played for Charles River Girls Hockey in addition to my high school team back in the day, obviously. And we had a tournament at Waterville Valley, New Hampshire, which is way up there.
Yep. Yep.
There was a ton of snow. There had just been a snowstorm. My teammates and I were staying in a cabin that had no cell service, and there was no hot water. And people who play ice hockey all know that you are very sweaty and disgusting after each game. And we were playing, I don't know, 4 games in 2 days, something like that. And I have a lot of hair, which is the majority of my shower. And
I can also relate.
Yeah, I know you're in the thick hair club. It has its pros and cons.
Yep.
Cold showers, I'd put that in the con. Ice cold water. And I knew I had to do it because I had just played ice hockey and it's disgusting. Yep. And I was going to do it again. And I was young when this happened. So all I kept thinking was, just get through this. But I remember that if that is part of your research, it's something you don't forget getting through.
Yep. Yes. So you're making a really, really important point in both cases, right? So in the cold water plunge, and this is the Wim Hof stuff, is you get in there and like the first thing that you want to do when you get into that cold water is basically your whole nervous system just goes on fire and you want to scream. And there's a response called the diver's reflex, which essentially like everything just pulls in. And if you've ever jumped into a freezing cold, lake or something, like your body just wants to like curl up into a ball and stop that cold from happening. But like you just said, if you can be in it and breathe through it and teach yourself to get comfortable with that extreme situation, this is actually one of the interesting responses that we're seeing with the cold therapy, is that this is what we call a hormetic response, which means you do something extreme to your body in very, very small doses. And if it was in a very large dose, it could be problematic, right? So if you stay too long in a cold plunge, you're going to get hypothermia, and that's not good, right? Eventually it could lead to death. But if you do it in very tiny doses, this is a stress response. Hormesis is this stress response to this acute stressor that seems to be having particularly good benefit on central nervous system regulation. Now, central nervous system regulation is very hot in the wellness and fitness space with HRV monitors and vagus tone and all these things. I just need to caution everybody that this data across the board is just so new, but it is really compelling to see how having that stress on the body eventually results in adaptation. And so that's what we think is happening with this cold exposure, is that you have all these physiologic processes. And actually, I need to myth bust here for one quick second, because
myth bust.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
One of my things that I love to do. I keep seeing this. I don't know if it's a TikTok or a reel or something where this person is speaking very authoritatively on cold therapy. And they're like, you have these things called cold shock proteins. Not a thing. There's no such thing as a cold shock protein. So if you ever see that video, just scroll right on by. That is not what is happening. It is not a thing. There is a thing called a heat shock protein, and we can talk about that. No such thing as a cold shock protein. What does happen are physiologic cascades, and also likely a connection between the mind and the body through that central nervous system that is going to have this adaptive response. And so with the cryotherapy, which is really interesting, and you explained it beautifully, is you get in and you're not really cold right away. But by the end of that 3 minutes, you're shivering, you're like, I'm ready to get out. And so it's having a different effect from what's going on with the cold plunge, but it kind of ends in the same spot, right? Where your core temperature gets really cold, your skin temperature gets really cold, and you have this stress to your system that we think is likely having a really similar response eventually to what's going on in that cold plunge. Now, what is the data actually showing? It's really limited particularly I'll stick to cryotherapy. So again, we're seeing to have this mental response due to this tiny stress or hormetic exposure. which could be potentially really good and why you feel great when you get out for mental clarity, potentially for calming effects, maybe something similar to meditation as you do this repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing pretty interesting effects on sleep, which, as we know, is very very tightly connected to central nervous system. So if you've ever used something like an Aura Ring or an Whoop, you'll know that they measure HRV, but they also measure sleep, and those two things are really related. So it seems there's a really cool study that was done in runners. They went for a good hard run before at the end of the day, and then they jumped into a cryotherapy machine. Same protocol as ours, 3 minutes, and they slept way better. So there's probably something going on there. And then there's potential, and this is a timing issue. So I said I was going to put a pin in this and come back to it. There's potential for human performance optimization. And by that, I mean recovery from an athletic event, potentially improved performance on a repeat event, but it depends on your activity. So this data is actually starting to emerge pretty conclusively, is if you are an endurance athlete, runner, biker, something like that, cryotherapy probably is pretty good for you for recovery. Again, that inflammatory response, you don't inflame your system like crazy when you run or you bike. It's also probably pretty good in between repeat performances. So for example, let's say you're a runner and in a single day, kind of like what you were, or a hockey player, right? Where you were talking about, I've got 4 games in a day. If you cool off in between each of those games, you might have better performance because you're blunting that short inflammatory response so that you can do it again, repetitively throughout the same day or the same weekend.
Right.
But where we're seeing some negative effects is if you do cryotherapy right after a strength training workout. So I always see this, and I'm very agnostic about CrossFit, but I've been seeing them a lot, that people will do this like crazy CrossFit workout. They're lifting really heavy. And then immediately after, there are all these videos and reels of them jumping directly into a cold plunge. It's actually a really terrible idea. And what we're seeing is, because of that reduced inflammatory response, we're seeing reduced gains after a strength training event. Why is this specific to strength training? Well, if you've ever done strength training, you got it exactly
you're
right.
Inhibiting that blood flow.
Yep, exactly. So after you strength train, you've done a ton of damage to your muscle on purpose. Again, this is a hormetic response. We've stressed our muscle, we've done some damage, and now we want our body to go back and fix it, right? And so this kind of stress from strength training is really different than going for a run or going for a bike. You're specifically straining and stressing and damaging a muscle or a muscle group. And that inflammatory signal needs to get to your immune system so that your immune system can say, I'm going to go repair this damaged tissue. And that's where you get the benefit of the strength training. You break it down, tell your immune system to fix it. They bring in some amino acids and some proteins, and they rebuild it so that it's bigger and stronger. If you blunt that response right after you strength train, we're actually seeing pretty dramatic reductions in strength. And in some cases, it's up above sort of 10% of effectiveness. So yeah, we want to be really careful about after a strength training session to not going cryotherapy or a cold plunge.
So, okay. So you mentioned there were studies on swimmers, and I'm now thinking, I've spoken to a lot of divers in the military, and there's all kinds of specialties in terms of physical, mental skill sets in the military. And a lot of the population I work with is people in the military who have these special skill sets. There's so many, but what could cryotherapy help with in terms of that level of performance, which is, as we discussed earlier, the difference between a professional athlete and a military athlete? There's a lot of similarities, but the difference is one is a life or death situation in a lot of cases. And that presents itself as a strong possibility for one versus the other. So what are the differences or, I'll just say potential studies, because we haven't studied all of this yet, for members of our military?
Yeah, it's such a great question and something that I care super deeply about. And the majority of our participants we're going to be using at Restore, we're hoping, are military members, warfighters, soldiers. Tactical athletes is the new term that we are using for them. And so, like you said, it's really important. The difference between, being on the podium or coming home at the end of the day is really a consideration. For cold therapy, there are a couple of really interesting areas of exploration that we're looking at. One is the recovery that we've just been talking about, right? So can you come back at the end of the day or at the end of your shift, get into a cold plunge or a cryotherapy machine and be recovered and ready to go for the next day? Because most of their work that you're going to, you think about when you're on deployment, for the most part, it's going to be long days on your feet, carrying a lot of equipment. So it kind of mimics that aerobic exercise more than necessarily something like a strength training session. So that could be an area of interest there. The other that's really interesting is, depending on the field of battle with which they are deployed, heat is always going to be a real problem as well. And so cooling is going to be a really important element. And one of the things that we're looking at is not only whole body cooling, but you might have also noticed at Restore, we have really localized cryotherapy areas.
I did see that.
Yeah. So it's like a little wand, and you can put cold on very specific areas of the body to reduce inflammation. Let's say you have a knee injury or something like that, and you just want to take some inflammation down, for whatever reason. That could be something that we really explore with our military as well. And not just for injury, but for actual performance. So here's something that's really fascinating. And this data is emerging. It's out of a group here. I'm out in Northern California. It's a group here in Stanford. And they're looking at very targeted cold application for continued performance out in the field or on, the field, whether you're a warfighter or the field or you're a football player. And what they're finding is really fascinating is that if you cool in specific areas of the body, you can actually preserve performance and perhaps even enhance performance. They've done a couple of really interesting studies where they've looked at pull-ups specifically. And what they did is they had people do a max set of pull-ups, and then they cooled in specific areas and then had them do the max pull-ups again. And the second time around, you would expect them to not be able to do as many. On average, their athletes actually did more pull-ups after being cooled. There's some mechanism here that has to go with essentially cooling the muscle, not so much central core cooling. And the areas that they're investigating that they're showing have interesting data are the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and the forehead. And so by doing that, you can actually extract heat essentially from your muscles, keep them at the correct temperature to work effectively, and that can potentially enhance performance. So that's another area that we're looking at besides the whole body immersion, also looking at very targeted and specific areas that can enhance performance during the actual act of whatever it is.
So is that like, as you're exercising, you're generating heat in your muscles. So you're going to be hotter than your baseline. And if you cool those muscles that are working, you're bringing them back to baseline so that they can continue to generate the force and strength that you need.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the theory here is that once your muscles get to a specific high temperature, they start to be less effective, right? So again, there are physiologic processes that have to do with mitochondrial processing of ATP, particularly using or not being able to use lactic acid as a fuel. It's a little bit complicated, but without going into a lecture about metabolism. But the goal is to keep that muscle in just the right zone of heat. So, you're an athlete, you'll remember that, you don't want to be cold when you go and do your event, right? So that's not what we're trying to do. You want to warm up. Yep, exactly right. And there is, specifically for mitochondria and muscle, there is a temperature range that they are just optimized, and it's slightly warmer than 98 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So it's a little bit warmer than that. But once they get too hot, things start to go sideways. And so the goal with this cooling is to actually keep that temperature within the range that is optimized. So then the performance becomes optimized.
Question. Is this optimal temperature different in men versus women?
Such a good question. And I believe this is not my actual field of expertise, but I believe the answer is yes. And this data is actually being investigated in a major way, particularly in soldiers. And what they're finding, I saw this beautiful series of studies when I was at the ACSM meeting in June. And they showed this in mice, they showed it in humans, is that females, particularly premenopausal females, so there's something funky going on here with estrogen and testosterone.
Estrogen, yeah.
Yeah, but premenopausal women are really, really, really good at dealing with higher temperatures than men are. So women are actually more optimized to deal with heat than are their male counterparts. How that's exactly working, they're not 100% sure. And they were doing these interesting mice studies. They were knocking out receptors for estrogen and testosterone and, whatever. They're trying to figure that out. But so, don't take this and be like, oh, like estrogen is going to be we got to balance hormones. It's like, it's
don't
a phrase that drives me bananas.
Estrogen.
Yeah, no. But that there's something there that females, again, premenopausal females are much better at dealing with heat. Mechanism unknown, but something interesting. Yeah.
My wheels are turning because I feel like I'm not good at dealing with the heat at all.
Yeah. It's, I think it's, there's also a mental component there too, right? So opposite side of the cold, you're either a cold person or you're a hot person, right? And so you're in Southern Florida now?
Southwest Florida right now.
It's a bajillion degrees there.
Here's the thing. I don't know why I'm drawn to these tropical places. I lived on the border of Texas and Mexico in 2010, 2011, when I was volunteering for AmeriCorps. It got up to 117 degrees. I really was not functioning optimally for sure at all at any point.
No, same. I am not a hot person.
But you know what it does is when you're from New England, there's kind of this bubble. I don't know how to explain it, but you're like, what's the rest of this world like? And you understand when you move to a place like Texas or Florida, you get this completely different perspective that pretty much the rest of the country has, or a lot of it. And you start to understand why people do the things they do. And if you are like, I had a friend who I met in Deep South Texas. She was an amazing runner, Kristen with a Y, shout out.
Shout out.
She's from Massachusetts, but we met in Texas. She lives in Colorado now. At one point, she lived in Hawaii and was training for the Boston Marathon. She trained in all this heat and humidity and killed it in Boston. Just the fastest person I've ever seen who I know personally. She was around 3 hours in one of the hottest, I want to say fast, it was, what year was it? Around 2014, 15, whichever year it was really hot around that time. Where the front runners, the African men who were supposed to win, one of them dropped out at mile 15 due to the heat that year. And my friend Kristen, smooth sailing because of her heat training. And it blew my mind. I was like, yeah, that heat, it allows you to deal with the cold in a different way, or kind of changes your mental thought process of temperature in a way that I can't explain.
Yeah, totally. And that's all physiologic mechanism too. So it's the same idea, just a different stressor, a different stimulus as the cold, right? So now you're applying the heat. You got to be out there, you got to be breathing, you got to figure that out. Also, we see, as I mentioned, there's no such thing as a cold shock protein, but there are things called heat shock proteins, which have really beneficial effect if activated, again, in these small doses. And that certainly can be beneficial if this is the same thing if you train at altitude, right? And you're going to go run a marathon at sea level, is that your body will respond by creating more red blood cells when you are at altitude. So then you're sort of, naturally doped when you get back to the sea level, and you're able to carry more oxygen. The same thing will apply for heat. And in fact, so we have the cryotherapy machines at Restore, and we also have infrared saunas.
Yes, I want to know more about that too.
Yeah, so the infrared sauna data is kind of the same about infrared sauna and cryotherapy versus their counterparts. So the infrared sauna data is really slim, but there's pretty compelling data on Finnish saunas and in steam saunas. So these are the old school ones. You remember these, like you go to a ski lodge, or, you're a New England girl, you go up north and everybody's got this, dry steam room that you can throw water on the rocks, right? And it will steam up the space. So most of the data is actually done on that in Finland. So same population as the cold water swimmers. And what we see is that utilizing that heat can actually be beneficial for athletes or warfighters that are going to be in that heat situation or slightly less. So for Kristen, when she was training in the super, super hot, over 100-degree humid weather down in Texas, and got to Boston. And for us in Boston, it's 90 degrees and humid and we're all dying. And she's like, hey, this is old hat for me. Like, this is how I train anyways. And she didn't feel like it was an added stressor for her. So it could be a mental component. It could be all these physiologic processes that have been adapted for her in that cold and that heat training. And so we see that with sauna as well, as we can use that. And interestingly, sauna, particularly Finnish sauna, has actually been shown to be what we call an exercise mimetic, which means it has a lot of that same physiologic stress effect on the cardiovascular system that aerobic exercise has. Now, without getting into the deep weeds on, infrared sauna versus exercise, they're not exactly the same, or Finnish sauna versus exercise. And you can't get in a Finnish sauna, even though you're sweating like crazy, or an infrared sauna, and be like, oh, I just did the same thing as, running 5 miles. It's not the same. You're not burning the same calories. You're not stressing the same energy systems. But it does seem to be that cardiovascular response, likely due to vasodilation, nitric oxide release, increased heart rate, all of those things are going to have a really beneficial effect on the heart muscle and the vascular system, which in these Finnish studies, which are really interesting and huge, and they kind of just keep coming out, are showing observationally that there seems to be significant benefit on cardiovascular risk for cardiovascular disease for people that do sauna.
And I'm gonna obviously read all of these studies now. But
I can send you a bunch.
I heard you emphasize observationally, and I want you to tell the listeners, how do you know a research study, because a lot of them get quoted, misquoted. How do you know it's a legitimate research study that we can actually use for humans?
Such a good question, and really, really important in this space. So I mentioned just a moment ago, we were talking about mice studies, and we're talking about observational studies and interventional studies. So there's a hierarchy, essentially, of scientific literature that starts, if we're just talking about humans, and I'll come back to animals in just a second, but if we're just talking about humans, there's essentially a hierarchy of the way that we conduct studies. And they typically will start with what we call population or cohort or observational studies. So I mentioned this just a few moments ago, is that this is the kind of study where you go out into real life situations and you say, what are these people doing? What are they eating? You either follow them for a specific period of time, this large, tens of thousands of people, and you watch them for 10 or 15 years. Or you get their medical records and you look backwards and you say, what have these people been doing, and what diseases did they come up with? What, mental health outcomes, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, these kinds of things. So that's an observational study. Now, that's a cool study because you get these huge populations of people that you can look at. So it's, like I said, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, generations of people. So there's a beautiful cohort study that happens right in Massachusetts and Framingham.
I was just gonna say Framingham.
the Framingham study, the Women's
nurses
Health Initiative,
study.
Nurses Health Study. All of these studies are observational, and they follow this cohort. I think Framingham's in its 5th generation now. So they've been following families of
Lots of
people over
nurses.
time. Yep, lots of nurses. There's a physician study. So lots of studies that look at people over time. Super, super strong study design to understand what we call, this is a really important word, associations between lifestyle patterns, exposures, and these health outcomes. Now, I'm sure that your listener has heard this phrase before, but it's worth putting an exclamation point on. Association is not causation, right?
I
So
love that.
association
Yes.
is not causation. So what that means is that there's a relationship, we think, between a particular input, let's call it going into a Finnish sauna, and a particular output, let's call it cardiovascular disease, right? That's interesting. And as a scientist, what I would say about that is fascinating. That is hypothesis generating, right? So the hypothesis that I would take from the Finnish study is you get this big population of people, the more times they go in the sauna a week, the less likely they are to have cardiovascular disease. I'm an interventionist, which means now it's my job to go in and say, we're going to take a smaller group of people, and it gets complicated because am I picking men? Am I picking women? Am I picking young women? Am I picking older men? But I take a population of people and I expose them to sauna, and then I follow them for a specific period of time to understand outcomes. Now, let me dig one layer deeper, because this is where all the sort of like biohacking and everything else starts to,
Before you say
come into
that,
play.
you mentioned causation and what was the word? Association. And there's a really great example of how we shouldn't fall into that trap. Can you remember what it is? It's on the tip of my tongue. It's like in the summertime, the more people who buy ice cream end up.
Yeah, the association is if you look at, so what you want to do when you look at associations is essentially you create a graph, and you have an x-axis, which is the horizontal axis on the bottom, and you have a y-axis, which is the vertical axis that goes up and down. And what you can see is in the association that you're talking about is that ice cream consumption is almost perfectly correlated with murder and homicide.
Yes, that's what it was. Yes, it's such a great example.
Yep. And to your point, this is actually comes right back to South Texas and has nothing to do with Texas, but it has to do with the heat, is that more people buy ice cream when it's really hot. And also heat is very agitating to the soul. And so more people commit homicide in the summertime. That's not to say that these are the same people, that the same person that's buying a lot of ice cream is eating or is
exactly. They have
going out and
nothing
running
to do with each other.
Right. So that is a really beautiful example, is that association is not causation, and we have to be super careful about these outcomes. So this is why these studies are what we call hypothesis generating. And then an interventionist goes in and says, I'm going to take this specific thing, I'm going to expose this specific population to it, and I'm going to see exactly what happens. So now there are sort of 2 layers that happen even within the intervention studies. The first is I'm a biochemist. So I really care about, and I've mentioned them several times, these physiologic cascades that occur during some kind of an exposure. I'll give you an example. In a study that we're doing for cryotherapy at Restore, I'm specifically looking at inflammatory pathways. And by that, I mean, I'm looking at 5 or 6 different, what we call cytokines, to see if they activate each other or activate independently because of a 3-minute exposure to cryotherapy, right? And so what I will do is I will take somebody's blood, I'll put them in the cryotherapy machine for 3 minutes, and then I'll take their blood right afterward and see what happens and see what changed, right?
Love it.
There's that, but then you can take it steps further. And this is what we're actually doing with cryotherapy, is I'm going to have people now expose themselves for 30 days, 3 times a week to cryotherapy. And I want to see not only what happens right before and right after every time they get in the chamber, but then what happens, this is adaptive response, over 30 days and over time, to see if there is a clinical outcome like reduced, changes in metabolism or changes in heart rate variability. We're going to be looking at some biometrics as well. So this is the part with intervention science, which is exciting and different from observational science, is that we can actually see whether or not our intervention is having a specific effect on that particular pathway, outcome, whatever. So now we can say, with some level, some degree of confidence, although we don't ever, definitively say anything in science, which always drives everybody bananas, but we can say cryotherapy causes fill in the blank results in inflammation. And this is the caveat, super important, in XYZ population. Not every population is generalizable to all other populations. We just talked about this a second ago with heat handling, is that premenopausal women, for whatever reason, potentially due to hormones, have a very different effect to heat than postmenopausal women. So you can't lump all people together. And this is why the science is so hard to explain and to communicate and to keep up with all the trends, because you can't say just because this happens in one population, it is going to be a cause of the same thing in another population. I'll put one more exclamation point on this. A lot of the data that we have in this sort of wellness health space comes not from humans, but from animals, and in some cases, even from cells of animals or humans, because we can't investigate some things in humans that we can in animals. So for example, if I wanted to look at cryotherapy and I wanted to understand specifically what is happening in a very, very targeted part of the brain, I can't stick a biopsy needle into the brain of a human after I do a cryotherapy session, but I can take a mouse, expose them to the cold, take their brain out, and then start to investigate what's going on in the actual physiologic processes. So to your original question, which is how do we know what kind of studies are reliable for these outcomes that we're looking for? You really do need to go and understand how the study was done. Was it in humans? Was it an intervention? Or was it a population level or observational study? Because that's going to be able to tell you the difference between, is it an association? Is it a causation? And if it's a causation, is it in the population that is relevant to you?
Right. And also who funded it.
Yeah, so this is where things kind of get complicated, and I'm definitely, I'll be super honest, I'm definitely towing that line right now with Restore, right? So this is something that I think is really worthwhile to talk about. Is yes, we do want to be thoughtful and careful about looking at who funds the studies, and I have to disclose in all of the studies that I do with Restore that I am affiliated with them, and that at the end of the day, they're trying to sell cryotherapy, right? And that certainly does present a conflict of interest. But the other thing that I would say is that the only place right now that good science can get funding is from essentially government dollars. So from the NIH or even potentially from the DoD to do independent research without external funding. In the space of exercise and nutrition, which is the space that I operate in, there is minimal, so tiny dollars that are being allocated to these studies, which drives me bananas, because I'm like, don't we care about preventive and proactive health? Like, I care so deeply about that. And I can't tell you how many times I just did a series of studies looking at CBD, right? Because it's everywhere. You can buy it all over the place. Do you know how many studies in humans looking at human muscle and performance there are utilizing CBD? 5.
No, 5.
There are
Wow.
five studies looking at CBD. And we have $1 billion industry selling CBD products, drinks, tinctures, gummies, all these things to people, right? And this was driving me bananas. So I was like, I'm going to go and I'm going to start a series of studies. And I can't tell you the amount of regulation that I had to thread needles to get funding. I got a little baby grant, basically showed that CBD does nothing. Sorry, team. And that post that study, they were like, we're not going to fund this anymore. Like, we don't care. So that line of research kind of like just went away. So this is where people like me, and I think of myself as kind of like a Trojan horse, right?
You're a total pioneer, and
I don't know about
you deserve a lot of props for this because, for example, because I've worked on three weight loss studies, and they all had different funding, and they're all completely different types of studies. But I always asked about the funding, and it's so difficult to get funding for any type of nutrition or exercise study because the money is elsewhere. And I'll also add that I do research on everything that piques my interest or people ask about. I was looking at the leadership of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics because, at our conferences, it's always kind of a conflict, like who's sponsoring what and you have to disclose, right?
Yep.
You disclose. That's what you're supposed to do. That just proves how ethical you are in your job, that you are disclosing everything. Now, I went to the AMA, the American Medical Association website, and I was interested who's running the AMA. I'm just curious because I also looked at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and what their backgrounds were, and how can we elevate nutrition to the status of the AMA. And if you go to learn more about each board member, you have to pay to read their disclosures and their conflicts.
They're at the AMA? Seriously?
Yeah.
I actually didn't know that.
On the website. And I thought, oh, wow. So you just gave us your disclosure for free.
Yep.
As one should. That's the ethical thing to do. And we don't know what conflicts our decision makers of medicine have without paying.
And I think so inherently what that does, which is problematic, is it automatically makes people skeptical of the science because we're rightfully so feeling like if, let's say, I don't know, Big Sugar funds a study and shows that sugar is actually good for you, right? We're like automatically skeptical, like, well, of course, right? But right. I will say around in the back side of this, I will say, especially if you have an academic appointment, which is one of the reasons why I'm, really adamant about making sure that I'm always working with academia, is that internally we have, mounds of paperwork that we need to do to make sure that we don't have conflicts of interest, that we disclose them, that we have oversight from IRB boards, and we've got, regulatory boards on our research side that are, constantly hounding us and making sure that we're spending money appropriately, that we're doing our statistics appropriately. And so there is a lot of checks that people, I think, don't see. That being said, we just, my partner at Restore, the chief medical officer, Rich Joseph, and I just wrote a paper for Stat News talking about how the wellness industry specifically needs to get better at doing their own research because there's money there. Let's be completely honest. Like, these companies are making a ton of money, and they're making a ton of money making claims that they really can't back up. But if we band together and we do things, like I said, become the Trojan horse and go into these spaces and say, I recognize that you are a company, you're trying to sell cryotherapy, and wouldn't it be awesome if you could actually prove that or demonstrate that the cryotherapy is doing what it says that it's doing? And I will tell you, consumers are really excited and interested in that because right now,
we have to start somewhere.
We have to start somewhere, right? Even though there is, you can raise your eyebrows at like, oh, well, Restore just funded this study on cryotherapy, right? Like, that's probably going to come out in their favor. one of the things that I said when I got the job is I'm not coming in to rubber stamp your products, right? Like I'm coming
Right.
in to help you evaluate them and to understand where they work, where the limitations are, what populations they work in. And I will say credit to this company. And, we've had amazing reception from a lot of CEOs of big companies that you've heard of to this Stat News article to say, yes, we need to start doing this. And what I think that will help to do is if we do this well as the scientists that are on staff, which I truly believe we can do, it will start to help the consumer, help the clients understand where's the BS, who can be trusted, what are the outcomes that I'm looking for? And if we're really honest as scientists, what are the limitations? So for example, at Restore, I'm like, don't come and do cryotherapy after you do your strength training. Like it's a terrible idea.
Right. That's so good to know.
Do it at another time. Do it the day after. Do it the morning of, right? But don't come. And that helps the consumer to say, okay, I've got this goal. I want to get really big and strong. And I also want to recover well. So when can I time this appropriately? Rather than just have, like, oh, cold plunges are really good for you because cold shock proteins, right? Like we have to start controlling the narrative here.
Buzzword, not even a complete sentence. Miracle beans.
Yeah, miracle bean. Exactly. Totally. So
Magic.
yeah, we have to start controlling the narrative. And the way that we do that is to bridge the gap between academia and Restore too, but academia and, industry essentially, and say, this is the science that we're doing. We're publishing it in the academic literature. You can look at our methods. You can look at our results. You can see what the limitations were of these studies, and you can see how we're using them in our marketing and in the ways that we interface with our clients. And I think that, at least I'm hoping, back to the point of funding, will help to create a more informed consumer so that they understand where to go, how to interpret this stuff, and also help them to make the right choices for themselves and not just be like, oh, well, they funded their own study, so obviously that's a problem. So that's what I'm hoping to do here. Trojan horse.
Well, here's the thing. What you're hoping to do and what I'm hoping to do is, I think, the same thing. And your experience and background is so important also for this major defense issue we're having in America, which all of this research ties into that you're doing. This isn't new. At one of our fancy food and nutrition conference expo, the big conference for dietitians, at one of our conferences, I always go to the military nutrition sessions, and at one of them several years back, one of the lecturers was talking about how our young people are not qualifying to be in our military, to even try. So what's the latest on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start by just saying that we currently, a couple of students, myself, and a couple of colleagues are actually writing a paper right now to understand supplementation practices and efficacy in warfighters. And the data is dire in the sense that like there's just hardly anything on this particular population, what works, what doesn't. You're probably really familiar with that IOC statement for sports athletes that basically show that there are 5 efficacious supplements that work for sport performance. And there isn't anything like that for warfighters because there isn't enough data. So that's something
so
that we're
targeted.
And to your point, is that these folks, I think the data is 74% of our military members report using dietary supplements, right? So 74% of them are using it, but we have no idea whether or not it's working, if it's helping, if it's harmful. And as you mentioned, the supplement industry is just kind of the Wild West anyways, right? Like there's very little limit, little regulation. You don't know where you're getting from. If you are a warfighter or you're an athlete, just put a little PSA out there is always make sure that your supplements are third-party tested and that you know exactly what is in them, because we're finding more and more. And I think you actually posted something about this the other day that There was,
Very
a study
likely.
a study that was recently done looking at herbals and how there are actually a bunch of banned substances in these products that you
Yes.
get at a reputable, you get it at GNC or you get it at CVS. And those, GNC and CVS aren't product testing. Like they're just selling the product,
Right.
right?
And
So
especially for our elderly, the memory booster
yeah,
and the brain health, you have to be very careful about that. And the also using a supplement for not what it is intended
yeah,
for is also a problem, and that
yeah,
happens a lot.
totally. And specifically for our military, that can be really, problematic, as it can for a sports athlete, is that if you take something and there's a banned substance in there, you're in trouble, right? For a sports athlete, they're banned
Mhm.
from their sport. For a military warfighter or tactical athlete, you can be, essentially fired or at least, reprimanded in a way that can be really damaging to your career. So this is, really important that we understand this. And yet, this is also sort of, a problem within the larger system of the military that you're talking about, is because people are so underprepared in the United States to serve. We get people that, are volunteering and they're, dedicating their life to serving this country, and they are, like precious gold because there are
Mhm.
so few people that can backfill. And so they're trying really hard to stay optimized. They're trying to make sure that they recover. They're trying to make sure that they can move through their entire career. And to your point of how dire that is, I believe the latest statistics basically show that less than 20% of the population that is eligible to serve. So that means, roughly between the ages of 18 to 23 or so, less than 20% of them are actually eligible due to lack of fitness, due to obesity, due to, legal issues, run-ins with the law. And this is the even more dire part, is that only about 3% of them actually want to serve. So of that
That's a
20%,
really
now,
small number.
yeah, now we're taking it down to 3%. And here's the other thing, is they're amazing, amazing, amazing humans that everybody else is
Mm.
fighting for, right? So this is the problem, is, you get these people that are motivated, they're excited to go and serve, they're physically fit, they're ready to go. And every industry wants that candidate that's 18 to 23 years old, right? And so this is where we whittle down and they say in the military, it's essentially, it ends up being 1% of the population ends up actually serving. They call themselves the 1%ers.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so this is something that this is just a public health issue. Like this is just a real crisis where public health and national security really intersect. A really amazing, also phenomenal scientist. Her name is Allison Brager. If you don't follow her already, she does work with soldiers. She's in the Army. Her
I'm on
area
it.
is sleep. Yeah, she's just, amazing. She is basically starting this campaign that fitness is national security, right? Like those two
Yes.
things are hand in hand. And this goes to the idea of what can we do to help once we get that very, very small percentage of the population into the military. What can we feed them? What supplements do they potentially need to take? What recovery modalities are going to be most helpful? And after they retire and they get out of the military, what wraparound services can we continue to provide them so
Very
that,
important.
yep, we have a VA system that is financially solvent, and we have
And
soldiers that come home
overloaded.
and feel supported, and they don't have the mental health issues due to everything that they have done for our country. So when I think about working for Restore and I think about these modalities and I think about the, nutritional supplementation, I'm really thinking of it from a perspective, and, my lens right now is really like, would I love to help you and me as, like weekend warrior athletes that are, trying to stay healthy for the long term and want to feel really good about ourselves, 100%. But applying this to a population that needs this, support so desperately across their lifespan because of what they volunteered to do for the rest of the country, this is really front of mind for me.
And what's the solution?
I mean, it's multi-pronged like everything in public health, right? So I have colleagues that are working in this space, from making sure that PE is taught in kindergarten all the way through, 12th grade, and that people are excited from a very young age to be active and find the thing that they love to do, to people that are working on the dietary guidelines, to making sure that those are, communicated effectively to schools so that they have the right food that is being served in the schools, all the way out to, like I just mentioned, is, there's this amazing initiative at the VA called the Whole Health Initiative, where, they're using a health coaching model essentially to help people be and feel supported in their health journey after they retire from the military. And these things can be applied whether or not we're talking about the military or the general population, right? So we know that disease rates, chronic disease of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, are only increasing because of our lifestyle. So how can we start to move that needle? I think the short answer of all of that is prevention is key. And starting young and starting early, and making sure that we use that upstream approach where we are helping people before they get in a situation that we need to reverse course. I think that's the big part of this.
Can I tell you about an argument I had?
Yes.
This goes back to Texas. So as part of AmeriCorps, I helped to bring in health and wellness to the IDEA public school system. It was at the time pretty new. It was started by Teach for America. And I got there, drove down from Boston. I'm on the border of Mexico, and I'm speaking to, there was some kind of pre-school year mixer. So I was preparing to be the wellness coordinator at my little school in San Juan, Texas. And we didn't even have every grade. We had kindergartners and maybe first graders, and then 7th and 8th grade, and I want to say sophomores or juniors. So I had different age groups, and I hadn't started yet, but there was an event where the teachers and the staff and the volunteers were meeting, and I spoke with, I won't be specific, but I spoke with someone who started the whole program.
Leadership.
And
That's
leadership.
Yeah, leadership. You spoke with leadership.
Yes.
Yeah.
Leadership, a very influential person in leadership. And I said, what do you think is the most important subject that is going to be taught or has been taught in these schools? And he said, math and science. And I said, oh, what about physical education? And he said, no.
Couldn't care less.
Not definitely not as important. And I thought, ooh, what bad judgment. This will backfire someday. He has since been fired. But it to me, it comes back to the mindset of, is it capitalism? Is it, how are we being most productive? And if you look at certain research and certain numbers, some people will say, oh, math and science are the most important. I don't know what research that is. Someone saw it at some point. Those are very important. We do a lot of math and science in nutrition and exercise research. Yeah. It's part of everything we do all day. But if we're not moving our bodies, and we're not thinking that's important, and it's a valuable asset to have and do and be every day, then we're more likely to have every type of disease, and our brains won't work, and our temperatures will be off, and we won't be able to cope with things like pandemics and have immune systems that work and can fight off, awful viruses and bacteria. And exercise is the base of what we need every day to function. So that was my thing that I have stuck to, which is don't tell kids they can't move.
Yeah.
It will backfire.
Yep.
For everyone.
Totally. And it backfires in the short term too. So there's pretty compelling data to show that if kids move, like during math class, if they are moving around and throwing a ball and standing on one leg, they do the math better. So this idea that exercise is just sort of like a fun way to, have a recess or to burn calories or whatever. I always tell people stop exercising to lose weight, right? Like that's not the point. The point is who cares, right? Like the point about exercise is all of these hormetic responses, coming back to exactly what we started this conversation about. Stressing
new buzzword, hormetic.
I love it. Hormesis. All of these hormetic responses that little bits of stress are really, really good for your body. They're good for your mental health. They're good for disease prevention. Immune system is super important. The data on, fit people and severe COVID infections is pretty interesting. So yeah, I just think it's so short-sighted to say we're going to cut recess or we're going to cut PE to improve math and science time or skills when we know that PE, that exercise, that movement only enhances the math and science. And, back to the idea of if we have people that are not moving their bodies, yeah, maybe they can, do their times tables, but, now we have a national security issue. Now we have a public health crisis. Now we have a mental health crisis because people don't know how to cope with being stressed and attached to their screens all day. So yeah, I think exercise, if I am a nutritional biochemist, I focus on exercise physiology. So the intersection between the two. And if I was forced to pick one to optimize, exercise or nutrition, it would be a tough call, but I think I would have to go with exercise because I think it has, from a whole body, health effect, I think it's more potent.
Which the mind is in the body.
Yep.
There's no separation. So
nope.
I agree. I've coached, I'm a health coach too. I'm a registered dietitian, but I'm also a health coach. I did health coaching on a huge international successful Dana-Farber study for 5 years, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And one of the things, I can't disclose any results because we don't have them yet, and I'm not allowed to anyway. But one of the things I noticed about it was all women in the study, women who had breast cancer, and were hoping to prevent a recurrence. One of the things I noticed was when it came to those who exercised and had that ingrained in their day-to-day or just general lifestyle values, it had a more positive effect on their diet. So
yep.
When you move your body, which, as you've said before, and this helped one of my study participants so much, she said, I hate exercise. I don't want to do it. And I said, oh, you're from my mom's generation who was told, you're not allowed to exercise. That's for the boys. If you sweat, that's a bad thing. It's uncomfortable. That was what my mom was told. Yep. Don't do it. Right? How ridiculous. So
stressful.
I said, I was trying to work on this participant's mindset for so long. And I said, all right, did you know that any kind of movement, because for her it was a word choice thing. I said, maybe exercise is not a good word for you. What if you move your body? And she said, oh. And over time, she told me, I signed up for a yoga class, which to me wasn't exercise the way I'm thinking, intense, Jane Fonda or, fitness guru P90X.
Yeah.
Some people think of exercise as that's all there is, but it can be going for a walk, hanging out in the pool and moving your body, dancing, singing and dancing in your kitchen. if you're moving your body, you are then allowing the things in your body to move, which after working on the research study and explaining why exercise was so important and not really having an actual answer with data to back it up, I started to think, why is exercise so important for cancer prevention, which again is not totally proven, but we know it helps.
Yeah.
And I started to think, oh, when you exercise, what happens? The scientific term one is peristalsis. So your bowels start moving, you start digesting more. So you're going to excrete either through urine or feces, number two, or through your sweat. You're not allowing the toxins that are in your body to be there as long.
Yeah, sure. And also with exercise, this, again, coming back to this hormetic effect, is that you're stressing your system, you're turning cells over more quickly, you're teaching your body to deal with damage and come in and rapidly fix it, which at the end of the day is, this is 30,000 foot level cancer, and I'm not a cancer researcher, but is essentially you start with DNA damage and it becomes a tumor eventually, right? And so if your body is prepped to handle that damage, which is what exercise teaches it to do, in addition to, excreting all these things that could potentially be harmful, you're in a much better position to fend off some kind of, unfortunate, and, most cancer is, it can be environmentally induced, but also it's just like winning the terrible lottery, right? Like, it's just like, why does it happen to some people and not to others? But if you can teach your body to deal with that damage, and that's something that exercise does, you stress your body out, you have this inflammatory response, it goes in, it cleans out all the damaged old cells, it brings up, new amino acids, new fats, whatever you need to replenish those cells and regenerate them. You get rid of the old and damaged cells in a more effective way. That is going to be protective against cancer.
Right. I call it your inner army. It's
totally, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it's, we really don't have control over the environment, like your average at large, it's a group effort. So let's say the environment is the cause for a certain tumor prevention gene getting turned off, and then that's why you have a tumor that's growing. If you have your built up inner army that is strong and fit and working well and communicating, then you're more likely to fight it off and to be able to handle any drugs that you need to take to fight it off, and to maintain your muscle mass, and to have more mental resilience along with the physical resilience, which I think goes together. But you have a much better defense, and that's what you have power over.
Yep, absolutely. Totally. It's one of these words, it's funny working in the wellness space, and I know that you operate in this space too. And it's a word that drives me bananas, is this idea that you can boost, fill in the blank, XYZ, whatever, I have chosen to word, and this is a kind of a controversial word too, and it's getting a little bit overused, but I've chosen to start using the word optimize, and I've used it a lot while we're talking. And the reason for that is you can't really boost anything beyond your human capacity, but you can take it to your human capacity, right? And that's how I think about optimizing, right? So I'm not saying like, I'm going to be, 110%. I had a professor once that said, there's no such thing as 110%. Like, there's no such thing as 110% effort. You can't get 110% on an exam. There's only 100%. Either you did the best, you got the best, you were, in the word, optimized, or you weren't. Right? Yeah, exactly. And so I love this idea of the little army, is that like, you got to build up your little army and optimize. So when you have some kind of an exposure or whatever, that you are able to deal with it. And this comes back to these micro stressors that we have, like you have adaptation. You start to build that little army when you exercise potentially, and be very careful about this, folks, but exercise in the heat, right? Or you get in a cryotherapy chamber, or you, have some kind of
you eat foods that are high in antioxidants, like
exactly,
raspberries.
Exactly. So yeah,
I love hydrated.
That. Yep. Stay hydrated. Yes. Also very important in the heat is to stay hydrated
and reduce the alcohol too.
Yeah,
that
totally.
That destroys
alcohol's
the
not
army.
A good choice.
Doesn't help with anything fun athletically.
Not a good choice.
And you also, there's so many little things that can destroy our cells or weaken them. And I've been a nerd about this since high school, when I would draw the phospholipid bilayer on on my little bio papers, and get into all the details. What can go in, what can come out. Oh, this is fascinating. We have control over this. But you offer so many opportunities for other people to learn about these things. And I noticed on your website, which I wasn't surprised about at all, which is rachelepojednic.com, which I'll link in the show notes. You are now offering a course that has some CEUs for some people who are health coaches and personal trainers. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. So this is an opportunity that I see.
And dietitians, I think.
And dietitians. Yep. Yeah. So, I have been, a member of the fitness and wellness space first before I even got into the academic side of this world. Is at 18 years old. And for those of you that are in the Boston area, you might remember this. I was a personal trainer down at Bally's Total Fitness in Porter Square, like way down that Porter Square, escalator, if you take the T out there. And I just loved, I was an athlete in high school. I just loved movement. It was just sort of, fun for me. I got into nutrition a little bit later because they overlap so well. But I love the fitness and wellness space. And I myth bust a lot in this space, and I try to take, a good solid science communication relationship and strategy with my colleagues in this space, because I feel that they are, speaking of an army, like they're doing all of the amazing on the ground work. They're running incredible classes. They're making people happy. They're bringing people into spaces that they feel comfortable to get sweaty. Like, wouldn't it be awesome if your mom had been exposed to that, way back in the day of really good people doing really good work on the ground there. But the problem is that in the wellness industry, for the most part, especially if you have a certification type of role, group fitness instructor or personal trainer, even health coaches, is you're trained to do that modality, right? You're trained to be a really good spin instructor. You're trained to be a health coach, which I would call a behavior change expert, right? You're trained to be work with somebody and teach them how to squat really well. But you're not necessarily trained about all of these nutrition pieces that overlap with that. There's just not enough time in the training. And there's a need for it because clients are often asking those trainers this question, right? And I will say I'm developing almost an exact replica of this for the military right now. I'm super excited. We just got curriculum approval. Yeah. So at Norwich, we're developing a 4-course curriculum for people that want to do this in the tactical space. So this is a thread that runs through, everything that I do. Is that I'm an educator. I'm a passionate believer in the people doing good work on the ground. And I just want them armed with good information and the right resources so they know where to go to get more good information. So that's where these courses came about. There's a long one. It's a 12-module course on basically nutrition 101. So we take a deep dive into
a lot of info.
Yeah, a lot of info. If you remember nutrition 101, it's a doozy. You can take a shortened version of that course. And then I've got a couple. One is specifically looking at the gut and the brain, what we do, and importantly, do not know about what the gut and the brain. We don't know a lot. And then there's also one on exercise and supplementation. So those are 2 little mini courses. And I'm hoping to have a few more that are coming out across the space. So, these are great for health coaches. I've done a ton of work with physicians and nurses who also don't get this information,
so important.
Super important. We know that this is, a huge risk, as we've been talking about with chronic disease prevention. And so, yeah, health coaches, personal trainers, fitness folks, as well as any health coach or healthcare folks that are interested in just expanding their knowledge. But basically, it's exactly the same course that I teach at Harvard, at Simmons, at Norwich, but you get it at a very discount rate, and you also get CEUs for it. So check it out.
Love it. Well, I could pick your brain all day, and I've taken up a lot of your time. So I want to thank you so much, especially because I'm getting back into academia, and I'll talk to you more about that offline. I'm very excited about it. And so everyone, check out rachelepojednic.com. I will link it in the show notes, and I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, great. And also reach out on social. So I'm at Rachele Pojednic on all the socials, and I love using those channels for science communication. So that's the majority of what I do when I'm online.
Yes, and I often link to Dr. Pojednic through my social, which is at Major League Nutrition. So find either one of us and follow both of us. And thanks for listening.
My absolute pleasure.
Hey guys, if you know me at all, you know I love to start my day with strong, good quality, organic coffee. I'm a big iced coffee drinker, mainly because of two reasons. One, I don't like to wait for things, and two, there's no way I'm letting my coffee stain my teeth. Therefore, I have to give a shout out to Alice, the creator of my new favorite straw, Sipify. We met in the Boston Businesswomen Inner Circle group and clicked instantly. Basically, she wrote to the group about her new product, the Sipify straw, a straw that you can safely drink hot or cool beverages with, that's made of stainless steel and food-safe silicone. I told her I thought her product was not only helpful to prevent yellow teeth. The main reason she invented this straw was actually to solve her problem of whitening her teeth at the dentist and then wanting to drink hot, not iced coffee afterward, which didn't make sense. She needed a straw for that. Alice told me her dentist suggested she switched to iced coffee so she could drink it with a straw and prevent staining her teeth. But she likes her coffee hot, and you can't put a regular straw in a hot drink. Ugh. So what's a girl to do? She literally invented a straw. This woman is amazing. The Sipify straw not only prevents stains, but it cools hot beverages just a bit as you sip, so you can sip comfortably. As a medical professional, this melts my heart because another amazing benefit is the possibility of Sipify straws decreasing chances of aspirating. The unique design of the straw lets you finally control the amount of liquid and the velocity of each sip, making it easier for people with swallowing issues to drink safely. If you're interested in purchasing a Sipify straw for yourself or for a loved one, hey, why not use it to prevent teeth stains while drinking red wine too? They come in a 2-pack, one regular size and one travel size, and the cleaning device. You can buy your straws by heading over to sipify.me. That's SIPIFY.me, and enter code Nicole, NICOLE, to get 10% off your entire purchase at checkout today.
Thank you so much for listening. Not only do we hope you learned tons about health and performance in this episode, but we want you to learn more. That's why Dr. Rachele Pojednic is offering 15% off of her educational courses for listeners of the Major League Nutrition podcast with code strongprocess15. That's all caps, strongprocess15. A link to the courses is in the show notes. If you like what you heard today, the best compliment you can pay the show is to save the episode, share it, download it, and there's also a way to donate monthly via the Major League Nutrition Spotify for Podcasters show. Any amount is appreciated and helps us deliver the best content more quickly to you.